Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode I'll be talking to Andrew Panton from the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre here in the UK. Andrew is lucky enough to be one of the pilots for their Lancaster Bomber, Just Jane. But before we get started, if you like what I'm doing, why not support the podcast via Patreon? The idea is pretty simple. Via the Patreon website you sign up to be a patron of the show, giving a monthly tip. Your support means I'm not paying out of my own pocket to host the website, buy the software and, more importantly, post USB headsets around the world for our guests in an effort to try and ensure that we get the best sounding interviews we can realistically get. You'll find the Patreon link on the website www.podcast.com, or you can go directly to it at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So if you have a spare dollar, I would be much obliged. If you don't, fair enough, enjoy the show. That is the iconic sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines on a Lancaster bomber. The Lancaster is arguably one of the most well-known planes designed and built in Britain during the war. When it came into production, it quickly became the mainstay of bomber command, with 7,377 being made, of which 3,249 would be lost. 125,000 aircrew served with bomber command, 55,573 would be killed. That's a 44% death rate, higher than any other service during the war, a large proportion of which would have been in Lancasters. This is perhaps one reason why the Lancaster is close to people's hearts. In a letter after the war, Arthur Bomber Harris, who had led Bomber Command, wrote to Roy Chadwick at Avro, who had designed the plane. The Lancaster surpassed all other types of heavy bomber. Not only could it take heavier bomb loads, not only was it easier to handle, not only were there fewer accidents with this than any other type throughout the war, the casualty rate was also considerably below other types. I used the Lancaster alone for those attacks which involved the deepest penetration into Germany and were, consequently, the most dangerous. I would say this to those who placed this shining sword in our hands: without your genius and efforts we would not have prevailed, for I believe the Lancaster was the greatest single factor in winning the war. Joining me is Andrew Panton. Andrew, before we talk about Just Jane, I wonder if we'd look at the Lancaster's early history and development.
The Lancaster was developed off the back of the Avro Manchester, which was a development for a medium to heavy bomber that didn't really work. It was fitted with engines that weren't really capable of doing the job. They had, I believe it was Vultures in it, which weren't very reliable, really. They had lots of problems with them. I think even probably one of the first raids, they lost some some Manchesters because the engines packed up halfway across the channel, that kind of thing. So in order to kind of counteract that, they started fitting the Merlin engines to a Lancaster. So it's a four-engined advancement, if you like, of the Manchester. So that's how the Lancaster was born. So it has four Merlin engines, slightly longer fuselage and bigger wingspan, and it became kind of the most famous heavy bomber that was used during the Second World War. The Halifax was the counter to it, if you like, the cousin, if you like, of the Lancaster, and that was used for bombing operations as well. As the Lancaster became better and better and used more and more, that the Halifax eventually was really reduced down to training operations towards the end of the war, training crews on heavy bombers ready for the Lancaster operations.
What made the Lancaster such a stunning aircraft over the Halifax? Because it really did supersede everything else, really, didn't it? It
did, yes. One of the things is that they say if it looks right, it is right, and the Lancaster certainly looks right. It's a bit like the Spitfire does for the fighters. But the Lancaster, when it was developed with a very open, continuous bomb bay, which meant it can carry a huge variety of bombs, whether it be the bouncing bomb, Grand Slam tall boy, incendiaries. So you can use it for a multitude of tasks, multitude of targets, whereas the Halifax has got a split bomb bay, even has some bombs carried in the wings. It wasn't as versatile as the Lancaster was for bombing operations. One thing about the bombing campaign during the Second World War is, depending on the target, you had to carry a different variety of bombs. So if they were attacking a viaduct, for example, they would take one of the big bombs, whether it be a tall boy or Grand Slam. If they were attacking industrial targets, they would carry a 4,000-pound cookie to knock the roof off the target, and incendiaries and smaller bombs to knock the target out. So the heavy bombers of the time had to be very versatile in what they could take, and the Lancaster really fulfilled that. Also, because it was used on the dam busters operations, which really caught the mind of the general public during the Second World War, it really came into the limelight then, really, because it was the only aircraft that could be used for the dam busters raids.
Was it intentional that it had such a big single bomb bay, or was because I don't think the original design spec called for one, did it?
No, the original design had to be a heavy bomber with a certain wingspan to fit in with a certain hangar and all that kind of thing. I guess that the bomb bay was something that Roy Chadwick, who designed the aircraft, decided that needs to be designed with it. Certainly when you get on board, you feel as though the aircraft is made around the bomb bay and then the crew's fitted in where it can be. So whether the bomb bay itself was the major point in design of the Lancaster, I'm not 100% sure.
How did they handle compared to the Halifaxes and other heavy bombers of the time?
It depends what pilot you speak to. If you speak to a pilot of a Halifax, then the Halifax was the best thing since sliced bread. If you speak to a pilot of a Lancaster, then they would say the same about the Lancaster. As you say, it depends who you speak to. So, some would say the Halifax could fly higher than a Lancaster. Some would say the opposite. But certainly speaking to Lancaster pilots, it was a very manoeuvrable aircraft for its size. The engine power was very good as well. So yeah, it was extremely manoeuvrable and excellent aircraft for the time period.
I met Tony Iverson a couple of years ago, who I'm sure you must have met.
Yes, yeah.
It would have been interesting to ask him about how it flew, because obviously he flew Spitfires as well, and he must be one of the few who went from fighters to bombers.
Yes.
Because that would be unusual. And what was its operational range?
Well, it carries 2,154 gallons of fuel. If you go by the book, it flies a gallon a minute per engine, and you can travel about 4 miles a minute. So you're doing about a mile a gallon. So that would suggest you can go about 2,000 miles. Obviously, if you're carrying a bomb load, you can carry less fuel because it's got an all-up weight. So depending on what the target was, how far away it was, you would carry less bombs because you needed more fuel. So if the aircraft was completely light, no bomb load, ammunition or anything, you could say the range was about 2,000 miles.
And how far would that get you into Germany?
Well, the furthest they did was somewhere like Turin in one flight. When they were bombing the Tirpitz, they did stop off in Scotland and had a stop off in Russia if required. So obviously they're carrying a huge bomb when they were attacking the Tirpitz as well. So it had quite a good range, but obviously the further you had to go, it limited the bombs you could carry as well.
In time-wise, we're talking sort of 10-hour flights, aren't we?
Absolutely, yeah. I think Turin was about 10 hours. Nuremberg could be up to 9, which is very East Germany. So yeah, it's a huge range on it. But obviously, the further you go, the more aircraft you've got to take to have the same effect as well.
What defence would it have to defend itself against the night fighters? Because these were primarily night raids, weren't they? We flew.
They were, yeah. Yeah, the Lancaster's got 3 turrets. It was originally designed to have 4. It was meant to have a turret underneath, a ventral turret, but that was eventually scrubbed because it wasn't really used very often, and at that point the German fighters hadn't got Schreigermusik, which is the upward firing cannon. So the lower turrets replaced with something like H2S radar. So the main 3 turrets, the front turret, mid-upper turret and tail turret, all originally had 303s fitted. Later on, the Lancasters had .5s put into the tail turret, so it had better firepower from behind. Certainly the tail turret was the most feared position on the Lancaster by a German night fighter pilot. It was one of the first positions they would try to knock out or certainly avoid if they had the opportunity to.
How effective were the gunners?
The gunners, as aircrew, were very effective. The guns they had to use, the 303s, against a night fighter weren't very effective at all, really. You had to hit a night fighter in the right place through the perspex and hit the pilot, or through a fuel line or hydraulic line, something like that, to have major effect, because they are effectively rifle bullets, and at however many 100 yards against steel or aluminium, they don't have the same effect as the larger caliber .5 guns do. Presumably
they only carried a limited amount of ammunition as well. I mean, the Spitfires had you see in the films, the Spitfires, they sit there rattling off 10 tens of seconds at a time. In actual fact, a couple of spurts and the Spitfires were out of ammunition. Presumably the bombers can't have been carried much more.
No, the tail turret certainly on the Mark 7 Lancaster, which has the 2.5 Brownings, you've got almost a minute's worth of fire per gun. So you're very limited, really. But the air gunners were trained that it's best to get the Lancaster out of the way of the fighter than to try and fight back, because as soon as you start firing back, you've got tracer and you've got muzzle flash, which are lighting your aircraft up.
What did they have for aiming? Was there anything technical to assist them?
They have an illuminated gun sight. Eventually, they moved on to something called AGLT, which is automatic gun laying tracking, which is kind of a radar-guided tail turret, which was a huge jump up from the original hydraulic turrets and manual turrets that they had. But yeah, there was nothing other than that. It was purely the gunner giving the target enough lead, depending on the speed and the distance. So it's very much manual.
How did he move his turret? Was it literally him just swinging himself around in the chair with his feet on the floor?
No, it's hydraulically operated. So there's a control column in the centre which you can rotate left and right to rotate the turret, or tilt towards you in a way to elevate and depress the guns. They're all run off individual engines, so the tail turret runs off, for example, the starboard inner, mid up the starboard outer, and the front turret off the port inner, for example.
So as he's moving the gun, the turret moves with the
Yep. It's all
the gun.
All connected, all moves together.
And how many crew members did the Lancaster carry?
So Lancaster's got 7 crewmen. In the very front, you've got the bomb aimer, and you come back to the pilot and the flight engineer. Back from them, you've got your navigator and your wireless operator. Then mid-upper gunner in the centre section and your tail gunner at the back.
But you have no co-pilot?
No, a single pilot on the Lancaster. They moved on to using a flight engineer. Early part of the war, for the Wellington, for example, they had 2 pilots, so a pilot and a co-pilot. But every time they lost an aircraft, they lost 2 pilots, 2 sets of pilot training, so that's 4 years altogether. So they developed the flight engineer role to look after the engine side of it while the pilot flew it.
So if your pilot was injured or couldn't fly back, essentially the crew had it.
Well, yeah, the pilot would generally train another crew member to be able to fly the aircraft. Obviously, wouldn't be as proficient as the pilot is, but the navigator, flight engineer, or the bomb aimer would generally take on the role of replacement pilot, so to speak. I would say that the hardest thing during that time is to actually get the pilot out of the seat if he's died at the controls, or if he's incapacitated somehow. You're trying to get a dead weight out of the pilot seat and get in yourself would take a long time. So generally they would fly the aircraft straight and level and allow the crew to bail out. So
there's only one piloting seat. I mean, it really is not like a kind of a modern aircraft with 2 sets of controls.
No, it's just the single set of controls. Yeah.
And the bomb aimer sounds self-explanatory, but I presume he did more than, otherwise he wouldn't be doing much for some of these long flights that they did.
Yeah, the bomb aimer was also the front gunner, so he was supposed to use the front turret when they weren't over the target. However, that was very seldom used. The bomb aimer was better off relaying back to the navigator what he can see, because he's got that huge blister on the front. He's looking out for coastline, viaducts, lakes, anything like that, and relaying it back to the navigator, because the navigator on a Lancaster can't actually see out of the aircraft. So he's reliant on others telling him what he can see and relate it back to his map.
So the navigator would be using presumably the stars through the is it the Astrodome?
That's right, yeah, you can use the Astrodome. The majority of the navigation was done on dead reckoning, so you're on a certain course, bearing for a certain length of time, change course, certain length of time. And then they advanced on to something called G, which is a use of aerials in the UK converging over a target, so you can find your position from those. And also they used something called H2S, which is kind of a ground mapping radar, which he could relate back to his map. He had a screen, there's a navigator's desk, showing effectively the reading of the ground below.
The bomber aimer is essentially just confirming, hopefully, where they are, that there's been no drift or anything.
Yeah, that's it.
Of the target, how much control did the bomb aimer have over the plane?
Early to mid part of the war, he just told the pilot left, right to line up with the target. The very later bomb sites, the bomb aimer could actually take control of the aircraft. It was switched through to him to be able to yaw the aircraft left and right.
How much flight training did a bomb aimer have in that instance?
Only really what he gained on navigation exercises and just normal flying exercises. It was all done from the bomb site. He didn't have any extra controls down there with him. It was all through the bomb site with the gyros and everything on the bomb site. Also, obviously, on the airfield, they had something called a link trainer, which was effectively a rudimentary flight simulator, which they could do time on actually flying the flight simulator, getting used to the aircraft controls.
If we compare the Lanc to the Halifax or the B-17, and I mean, how did it compare?
The Lancaster, you could say, was a more effective bomber. However, it was much more difficult to get out of than the Halifax. The Halifax had a bigger fuselage because obviously it took away some of the bomb bay and had a larger fuselage, so it's much easier to bail out of. It didn't fly quite as high as the Lancaster for bombing operations, so it was more susceptible to the lower flak, so the Halifax lost more in that respect, but the Lancaster, you could say, lost more crewmen because it was more difficult to bail out of. So it's a little bit like the Spitfire Hurricane debate. It depends which camp you fall into as to which you see as the best bomber. There are a lot of facts out there to suggest the Halifax could well have been the best bomber of the Second World War when you take into all the aspects of it. But certainly effectiveness at bombing, you could say the Lancaster was the better bomber.
That's best of the British bombers?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The B-17 must be relatively comparable. I think it had a smaller bomb load though, didn't it?
Yeah, the B-17 only carried about 4,000 pounds, whereas the Lancaster was 22,000 pounds. So the B-17 you could compare to a Mosquito, which carried the same bomb load. B-17, of course, had 10 crew members, whereas the Mosquito had 2 crew members. So the B-17's carrying an awful lot of weight in men and ammunition to carry a small bomb load to the target. Of course, also they did daytime operations, which were extremely dangerous, but they did fly in formation and have everyone else, all the other aircraft's protection as well. So I don't think you could really compare a Lancaster to a B-17 because they are so different.
I didn't realise that. And the Mozzie would be massively faster compared to the B-17 in that instance as well.
Yeah, Mosquito could go to the target twice in the time it would take a B-17 to get there.
So I think everyone's sort of familiar with the outside of the Lancaster, but very few people have really seen or have a feel of what the inside is like. I wonder if you could tell us how did the crew get into their stations?
The main crew doors at the rear to the starboard side, so just forward of the tailplane. So the crew members would get on there and make their way to their positions. One of the biggest obstacles for the crew going forwards is the mid-upper turret, which they need to effectively crawl under or scoot around. And then the 2 spars, the rear spar and the main spar. So extremely tight getting over the main spar, especially if you're in full kit with the Irving jacket, the Mae West, and the parachute harness. So the bomb aimer's got the whole aircraft to go through to get to his position. The later Lancasters that had a larger mid-upper turret, they actually started to use the front escape hatch with a ladder to actually board the aircraft, so they didn't have to get around the mid-upper turret.
And when the crews are at their positions, is it very cramped positions? I mean, you see the outside, it looks like a big aircraft.
Yeah, we refer to it as a reverse TARDIS, so it's a lot smaller on the inside than what you'd expect it to be. The most cramped positions, you could say, are the tail turret and the mid-upper turret. The bomb aimer effectively lays down, so he's leaning forwards. His position there is quite large. The pilot has obviously sat down for the whole operation at the controls. The flight engineer has a dicky seat beside the pilot, which he sits on for takeoff and landing. The rest of the time, really, he's stood or knelt at his panel, which is just behind him as he sits. The navigator sat down on quite a large bench seat. Wireless operator is sat down, of course, at his radios. So they're mostly seated positions, which is good for a 10-hour operation. The flight engineer is the only one really that is stood up and knelt.
Doesn't sound very comfortable for 10 hours.
No, especially if you consider they could be corkscrewing with G and all sorts of things. It's not the best position to be in. There
is no creature comfort whatsoever. I mean, is the heaters, toilets?
There's an Elson toilet at the back, just forward of the tail gunner. But you wouldn't want to be caught on that if you were corkscrewing out the way of a fighter. And there's a heater at the wireless operator's left leg, which does also come through to the cockpit a little bit. It was also diverted down to the tail turret using extra airflow from outside. The trouble with that, they found, is the hot air that came into the system was instantly cooled down by the extra airflow required to take it to the tail turret. So it was normally turned off before it got to the tail turret.
Your family's interest started with your, I think you said it's your great uncle, Christopher. I wonder if you could tell us his story.
Well, he joined up, he volunteered for aircrew Bomber Command. Obviously accepted, went through all the training courses, became a flight engineer, and was based on Halifax's with 405 Squadron, 419 Squadron, and eventually 433 Squadron at Skipton-on-Swell. He almost did his tour. He was on his last operation when he was shot down over Nuremberg in 1944, March 44. He was lost in that operation along with another, I think it was 3 crew members of his Halifax on that night, so 31st of March 1944. And as a memorial to him, the centre here was set up, and the Lancaster was purchased and moved here. In 88 it moved here.
So it's your grandfather. It's your grandfather and your uncle?
That's right, yeah. They set up the museum here.
So they saw a Lancaster for sale. How did they manage to go around? What was the story about purchasing that?
Well, it took about 16 years all in all. They saw the aircraft for sale at Squires Gate at Blackpool. It was up for auction. Fred Panton went to the auction, but the aircraft didn't reach its reserve, and it was bought just afterwards privately by Lord Lilford. Fred kept in touch with Lord Lilford while he owned it. It stayed at Squires Gate for a long period of time while Lord Lilford owned it, and then it was moved as a gate guard at Scampton. Eventually, in about 1983-84, Lord Lilford decided he would be happy to sell it, and previous to that he had told Fred and Harold that they would get first refusal of it. So when it did come up for sale, obviously Fred and Harold purchased the aircraft. It did stay at Scampton's Gate for about 3 or 4 years while we built the hangar here at East Kirkby and prepared the centre ready for the Lancaster to be brought here. And then in 87, movements were made to start to move the aircraft, and it moved here in the summer of 88.
When you got it, what condition was it in?
It had been maintained quite well cosmetically by the guys at Scampton, the RAF at Scampton, but the engines hadn't been running for 22 years. Obviously the aircraft hadn't operated or anything while it had been stood there. It was moved by road to Scampton, and then it was moved by road from Scampton to East Kirkby. So there was quite a lot of work to get it back up to into a ground running and taxiing condition as it is now.
Where do you find Lancaster technicians?
We're quite lucky in the fact that BBMF are still obviously training people up on Lancasters, whether it be pilots or ground crew. So the 2 that we have at the moment were both based with BBMF at
That's
Coningsby.
the Battle of Britain?
Yeah, Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Yeah, that operate the PA474, the Lancaster that flies in the UK. We have a couple of engineers at the moment, airframes and engines, engineers that came from Coningsby. They did their time with BBMF and left the Air Force and came to work for us.
Just Jane is your Lancaster. What was its operational history?
It was a Mark 7 Lancaster, built in April 1945, so it's just turned 70. It was originally produced to go out as part of Tiger Force. So NX611 Just Jane here and PA474 at Coningsby were both going to be part of Tiger Force and go out and continue the war out in Japan. Obviously, the Americans dropped the atomic bombs, and the Lancasters never got as far as Japan, so they were eventually mothballed until the early 50s, at which point the French Naval Air Force decided they would like Lancasters as part of their fleet for maritime reconnaissance and air-sea rescue work. So several, I think it's probably about 50 Mark 7 Lancasters, NX611 being one of them, were sold to the French for use in that role. They went out as far as Morocco and Australia and did maritime work. It was painted white. The middle of the turret was removed. The guns from the tail turret were eventually removed, and different equipment was added on. Extra 2 or 3 crew members were added to the aircraft. And it did a lot of that work until the 1960s, when it was retired because of scarcity of parts and the expense of keeping the aircraft running. They moved on to a DC-6, I think it was, that they moved on to, which was a lot easier to maintain and cheaper to run. So the Lancaster was retired while it was out in Australia. During that period, a British contingent of people called Historic Aircraft Preservation Society were interested in preserving a Lancaster. And they contacted the French Naval Air Force and eventually agreed terms to be given an NX611. They always had a great fundraising period, both in Australia, on the beaches of Sydney, and in the UK here as well, to raise the funds to fly the aircraft back.
Just Jane is running. What does it feel like when how do you start it up? What's the procedure, and how does it feel when you get it going?
We allow taxi riders, so we take 10 people at a time to have a taxi ride on board the Lancaster. We do a 20-minute taxi run for them, so they obviously board the aircraft. We start the engines up and taxi it around and bring it back. During that, they have a quicker run as well, so we take the engines up to 2,000 RPM and go for a quick run down the grass landing strip that we have here. By way of operating the aircraft, we start the starboard inner engine, then the starboard outer, port inner, port outer, until all 4 engines are obviously running. They're Merlin 24s, they're 27-litre, 1,640 horsepower. The engines with the prop on and the fuel in weigh just over a tonne. So they're big engines. Obviously, when they're running, they're quite loud from the outside. Slightly different sound inside to what you hear outside. But certainly being in the aircraft with those engines running is quite a feeling, very emotional for a lot of people.
There's 2 Lancasters left flying. I presume yours is the closest thing. Is there any others left that are still running to the condition of Just Jane?
There's one other in Canada at the Bomber Command Museum of Canada at Nanton in Alberta. That's just got the 4th engine running, and it's just got the brake systems working, so it can, although it doesn't have any room to taxi at long distance, it can physically taxi. So yeah, there's one flying in Canada, one taxiing. Same in the UK, one flying, one taxiing. And
what's your long-term plan for Just Jane?
We are continuing to make the aircraft airworthy. So every year we make advancements to that end. So we can sit here and say, when the aircraft stood outside, that it's completely perfect, if you like, in absolutely perfect condition, airworthy, stood there at East Kirkby.
I have to say, I was going through the maintenance logs yesterday, and it was quite a thrill going through them all, looking at the pictures, which are all on your website. Does it take a lot of maintenance to keep it up to spec?
It does, yeah. I mean, we've got kind of 2 lots of maintenance. We've got the maintenance for it taxiing, so to keep it in a taxiing condition, the annual work that we have to do to the engines and everything to make it ready for the next taxiing season. But we also have a huge list of things we have to do to make the aircraft airworthy. They're the more in-depth things, the things that take a lot more time, because obviously there's bigger bits you have to take off and overhaul and put back on. So we only have a short period of time to do that in over the winter. So we go from kind of mid-November through to mid-March for the winter maintenance. So there's a very short time period there that we have to do an awful lot of work in. So it's a very interesting time, but can also be a very stressful time as well, as the first taxiing date looms.
Well, Andrew, thank you for your time. Just Jane can be found at the Lincolnshire Heritage Centre at East Kirkby here in the UK. There's plenty to do at the museum, built around an original Second World War airbase. The control tower has been restored, and in the main hangar you can pass within feet of Just Jane while looking at the other exhibits. If you are interested to experience a taxi ride in the Lancaster, which is probably the closest any of us will come to actually being in a World War II aircraft with the engines running, booking details can be found on the museum website, linksaviation.co.uk. That's LINCS aviation.co.uk. On the website you'll also find all the dates listed for the special events that are run regularly through the year. I've also put the link on the World War II podcast website, www.podcast.com. Well, that's it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.